Our next guest joining us is Mr. William Hammond of the New York Daily News. He's an editorial writer and political columnist for the News. He operates out of Albany. The New York Daily News is the fifth largest paper in the United States. And he specializes in political, legislative, and fiscal matters. He was previously with the New York Sun, the Schenectady Daily Gazette, and the Glen Falls Post-Star. Thanks for joining us today, Bill.
Well, thanks for having me on, George.
You and I were the first ones out of the chute, and I should say, for the sake of the record, that from time to time I quote Bill Hammond in articles, essays that I write, and from time to time I'm happy to report he quotes me. But you and I basically came out of the chute early on. I wrote a column for the Post entitled "Eliot Spitzer Confessed Criminal," and you wrote a piece, "Spitzer's Still Inflated Self-Image." For our listeners, you may recall that Eliot Spitzer, when he was the chief law enforcement officer of the state of New York, and when he was the chief executive officer of the state of New York, was out haggling and hiring prostitutes, breaking the law. He broke state laws, he broke federal laws as well. Eliot, what was your first reaction when you heard that Eliot Spitzer was coming out of the woodwork and decided the world couldn't live without him, at least New York couldn't live without him, and joined this race for comptroller? What was your gut reaction?
My gut reaction was to be repelled. And the thing is, for people like me who followed his career closely, I especially followed it closely when he was governor because it was sort of my day-to-day job. When the prostitution scandal hit, it came after a bunch of other scandals and other turmoil and trials and tribulations that we had all been through together. It was kind of a final straw. Obviously, it was the final straw in the sense that he resigned, but and I have to say, it came completely out of the blue. This was not something that I don't think there was a single person around the Capitol. There certainly weren't any rumors or murmurings about this. It didn't fit his profile. It didn't fit his image as a public official that he would be dallying with prostitutes. But he had not been a successful governor. He had disappointed a lot of people long before the prostitution scandal, and it was too early to say whether he would have been reelected. And being a Democrat in a heavily Democratic state, he might have had that chance. But the immense promise that he took office with only a little more than a year before had largely evaporated, and people were coming to find that he was kind of flailing around and over his head as governor.
Well, I agree. His first budget, in my judgment, was a disaster. The battles he had with Joe Bruno, his vulgarities dealing with members of the legislature. I know there was one of his minions who went out and lectured a bunch of Democratic legislators, basically telling them, listen, we're smarter than you guys are dumb, so just do what we tell you to do. So do you think part of the flaw was not only the flaw in the character of Eliot Spitzer, but all the beauties that surrounded him who thought they were the smartest people in the world, and so they played off of one another to start investigating someone like Joe Bruno, the Senate Majority Leader in Troopergate, abusing the police power of the state troopers? So what do you think drove Eliot to this? Was it just a character flaw, part of his personality, where he decided he was the only guy who had answers and everybody had to listen or else? What was your observation during that period up in Albany?
Well, he himself diagnoses his own failing as being hubris, which is kind of a fancy way of saying he has a big ego, and he often it comes across almost every time you see him speaking in public, or in private meetings, or in press conferences. He has very strong opinions, and he considers himself to be the smartest one on any given issue. And people who disagree with him are suspect. Either they have corrupt motives or they're just not as smart as he is. And I don't want to let personalities play I try to look past personalities when I'm writing about politicians, and I try to focus on the substance of what they're trying to do and whether it's taking the state in generally a good direction or not. And I happen to have agreed with a lot of the things he said he was trying to do and why he was trying to do them. But this was a case where his personality got in the way again and again and again, where he would make enemies of people that he needed to be allies, and he would bully people, which sometimes will get you what you want in the short term, but will poison the waters in the long term. A famous example of that was the fight over replacing a state controller when Alan Hevesy, was forced to resign because he was pleading guilty to
Controller, just for the record, Controller Alan Hevesy was forced to resign from office due to some scandals in that office. The Office of Controller is the sole trustee over $150 billion worth of pension money, as opposed to other states that had his board. So there was scandal, and he was forced to resign. But go ahead, Bill.
So he got in, this is very early in his governorship, and he comes up with what I thought was actually a good idea, that instead of just picking a political hack for the job, we should have a serious search. And he appointed, a blue ribbon panel to do the search. And but when push came to shove, the legislature decided they didn't want to pick one of the outsiders that the search panel had come up with. They wanted to pick a member of the assembly, a guy named Tom DiNapoli, a loyal Democrat, generally well-liked, but had no particular qualifications in the world of finance. But that was the guy they went with. And Spitzer chose to go to war with the legislature over this.
Well, if memory serves me correct, he went to war, but at the end of the day, the way the state constitution reads, the legislature had the sole say in the decision. Isn't that correct?
Well, yeah, that's it. I mean, it was a losing fight because he had no legal leverage. There was no lawsuit he could file. What he thought he could do is he could kind of embarrass individual members of the legislature by going into their districts and calling them corrupt. It didn't work. It backfired. It lost him the goodwill of fellow Democrats that he was going to need to get other hard things done, and that was sort of an early fight that he didn't need and cost him a lot of political capital right out of the box. Yeah. Now,
go ahead.
I wrote that the column you started quoting. I've sort of seen my role in covering this current election where he's running for New York City controller. I view my role, other people have written a lot of stuff about his the prostitution and that's it needs saying, right? I think it's a completely irrelevant issue. But I wanted to remind people about other things they need to think about. So this week I wrote about his budgeting, and part of his argument for becoming city controller is, I may be personally flawed, but I know a lot about finance. I know a lot about Wall Street, and I know a lot about government budgeting. But in fact, when he was governor, his budgets had pretty significant flaws to them.
Oh, the first budget he put out there was up 10% in spending versus an inflation rate of about 2% at the time, if memory serves me correct.
Well, those aren't exactly the numbers. The numbers that I used were 8%. The state part of it, the state-funded part of the budget, was an increase of 8% in his first year, and it was about 5%. He started out at 5% in the second year. And he presented these numbers, first of all, he presented them as being conservative, only on the basis that they were slightly smaller increases than had gone before him. And he kind of forgot that, he needed to negotiate with the legislature. They were inevitably going to add more to what he wanted, and so you were going to start from 8 or 5 or whatever it was and go up.
We only have a few seconds left, so he was not the fiscal conservative he tried to make himself out to be. I agree with that. At the end of the day, do you agree that character still matters regardless of what one's positions are, and do you think that's how the people are going to judge this in the coming election? We've got about 30 seconds.
Actually, the polls are a little bit all over the place, but I think the general sense, at least among Democratic voters in New York City, is that they are willing to look past the character issue, at least specifically the prostitution issue, which is why he's ahead in the polls. He's still, his days as Attorney General and the Sheriff of Wall Street, a lot of people remember those fondly, and so that seems to be a lot of why he's gotten the support that he's gotten.
Well, we'll see what happens. I'm of the school that character still matters, and that disqualifies you from office, but we'll see what the Democrats do in about 10 days. Bill, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate you finding the time.
It's a pleasure, George.
All right, I'm George Mullen, and this is Steve Malzberg's show.